Hi, I'm Mike from Lucid. Welcome to the third installment of how to milk as many videos from the same M12 tools as possible. So you've seen me swap a 1/4 inch anvil into a Gen 2 M12 fuel hex impact. Then I took it a little further and swapped a 1/4 inch anvil into the new version, the Gen 3. Logically, there's only one thing left to do, besides adding lasers or turning it into a flamethrower, and that's to swap in a 3/8 inch anvil. I'll be honest, it's not that the swap was overly difficult, it's just that it wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. You've seen me take this thing apart in another video, so let's just skip ahead to the modifications. The anvil that I bought is part number 42-06-1010, and at first glance, everything looks good, but when I tested the fit, I realized that the pin on my impacting assembly is smaller than the one on the tool that this originally came on, so I'll have to address that. I pulled a couple of measurements to see how much I needed to remove from the bronze bushing that's pressed into the front of the gear case, and then I got a rough estimate of the size of the hole in the back side of the anvil. Now, I don't have a pin gauge set, and my bore gauges don't go quite small enough for the opening, so a trick that I like to use is to find something like a drill that's close to the same size and then take a measurement off of that. I'll be testing the fit of the part I'm making as I go, but it helps to have a good idea of how much I could remove on the first passes. I checked the hardness of the anvil with a file just in case I needed to do any modifications to it, and as AVE would say in his PG version, it's hard as a coffin nail. The difference between the pin diameter and the ID of the anvil is roughly 50 thousandths, so I'll need to make a bushing to take up the space. I don't keep a ton of brass around, but I lucked out and found this piece of brass tubing that'll work perfect. It's a bit too large to fit in the anvil and a bit too small to fit over the centering pin. Looks like it's around a 3/8 inch diameter piece. Alternatively, I checked McMaster-Carr and you can get a small piece of bearing bronze for around $5 plus shipping. I checked the depth with a caliper, but you'll see later on that it needed to be fine-tuned. To bore out the opening, I need to set this part up in my lathe, but these ridges are preventing me from seating the part all the way against the face of the lathe chuck. A trick that I like to use is to take a set of parallels and put them in the jaws behind the part so that I can space the part forward. It's hard to see what happened here, but I almost messed up pretty bad. If you can spot what happened, let me know down in the comments. Also, go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you like these kind of videos. It lets me know that I should keep making them. The front of the gear case housing has a sintered bronze bushing either formed or pressed into it that makes it pretty easy to machine on a lathe. I took measurements as I went and bored it out until I was happy with the fit. Now let's go ahead and make the bushing. Pretty standard stuff here. I started out by facing the end of the part. To get an estimate of how far I need to turn it lengthwise, I have this 3D printed indicator holder that clamps onto the bedway. I zeroed it out, so now any distance that I traveled towards the chuck is a measurement of how far I traveled off the end that I just faced. I picked an obligatory number that was longer than what I needed and then zeroed out the indicator again. Now I just have to work back to the zero. Always wait for your part to cool down before you take a measurement, unless you want parts that don't fit. Then go ahead and take measurements on a warm part. Rinse and repeat this process until the part is at the size that fits the anvil. To bore out the bushing, I have this adorable little boring bar that came from an online auction that I won a while back. This isn't even the smallest one, and they came with a bunch of adapter bases that stepped them up in size. To set my parting tool, I normally butt it up against a flat spot on one of the chuck jaws and then lock it into place. I used the anvil as a guide to set where I had parted off at. I was left with a bit of material at the end of the part that I removed with some filing and sanding. The fitment was good, but I noticed I was left with a gap between the anvil and the impacting assembly due to a small shoulder at the base of the pin that wasn't taken into account. My solution was to use some tape to keep it in place and to keep anything from getting out of the impacting assembly, and just size it with a right angle die grinder and a sanding pad. That gave it a much nicer fit. Once again, I used some super lube, but this time I cleaned out as much of the original Milwaukee grease as possible beforehand. I made the mistake again of putting a little too much on the anvil hole and ended up fighting an air pocket that wouldn't let me seat the anvil all the way down. I made sure to lube up all of the important parts before putting it all back together. This ring gear gets installed with the groove facing the back cap. I mentioned in my other Gen 2 video that the back cap needed to be installed so that the part without the bump is on the same side as the tab on the outside of the gear case housing, and then I just tapped it into place. Lift up on the motor a bit to get the gear case back in. You may need to turn the anvil to get the gears to mesh and allow the motor to drop all the way in. Install the other half of the clamshell. Put the screws back in along with the clip in the battery slot and you're good to go. I made myself a low-tech test jig to check the tool's performance. I tightened the bolt to 75 foot-pounds with a torque wrench, which should be no problem for the tool since it's rated for 1300 inch-pounds or around 108 foot-pounds of torque. That's right around lug nut specs since a lot of my smaller vehicles only call for 80 foot-pounds. The tool didn't even blink. If you liked this video and found it helpful in any way, hit that subscribe button. If you don't have a metal lathe but want to learn more about them and which one you should choose for your first, check out this video right up here.